$1 passed across a kitchen table in exchange for a small bag, it seems harmless enough. But that single bill is about to begin a secret journey from a street corner through hidden businesses and shadowy accounts, until it finally appears as clean money on a balance sheet. This is money laundering, not a clever trick from the movies, but a constant struggle between those who try to disguise criminal cash and those who try to follow the trail. Tonight, we follow $1 and uncover how cartels depend on bankers, businesses, and loopholes to keep their empires running. This is the banker of the cartels, how money laundering really works. Quick note before we continue, 98.7% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying the story, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and makes sure you don't miss the next episode. A single dollar changed hands so quickly you might have missed it. It slid across a scarred kitchen table, folded twice, palmed without drama. The room smelled faintly of fried food and yesterday's smoke. A fluorescent bulb buzzed, casting a thin rectangle of light over the transaction. On one side, a young man with tired eyes kept his answers short and watched the doorway. On the other, a woman with a practiced calm counted the bills in a movement that looked almost ritual. When the exchange finished, the dollar was no longer simply a piece of paper. It had a history now, a context. The air of that room, the pair of hands, the hurried breath. For a brief instant, the bill belonged to a story no one would tell. Out in the city, the night was a different kind of quiet. Neon bled into puddles. Somewhere, a delivery van idled, engine ticking as it cooled. The dollar, folded and tucked into the corner of a worn leather wallet, moved with the seller toward a back alley where others waited with similar bundles. Money in this corner of the world arrived as a tide, small repeated purchases that pooled into something bigger. The seller's role was simple: produce, collect, survive. The buyer's role was episodic: pleasure or escape in a crumpled note. Neither thought much of the ledger they were helping write. Most people who touch dirty money never see how wide the stream runs or how many hands stir it before it reaches anything that looks like legitimate life. That night, a courier took the bundles, not the single bill on its own, and the small stacks were combined with many others. They were counted under a weak light, labeled with a shorthand only the group understood, and moved into a nondescript van whose license plate matched no known pattern, and seemed, to anyone watching from a cafe across the street, to belong to a delivery company. The van's route wound through the city like an artery. It stopped at a laundromat where some money stayed behind and was folded into the register. It stopped near a diner where an employee with a sidelong look tucked a thick envelope under the counter. In each place, the cash stepped sideways into a life that accepted paper without questions. In other places, it was parceled into boxes and sent across town, or handed to a man with a cell phone and a smile who promised it would be taken care of. This tale is not about the romance of smuggling. It is about transformation, and transformation rarely happens in a single heroic act. It is a series of small accommodations, choices made by people who are trying to balance profit, safety, and survival. The man who owned the van wore a crisp uniform on weekdays and a different face at night. He paid his rent like everyone else, and once had a daughter who asked him to come to her recital. He also knew that the envelopes in the van would buy favors for people who could not be reached in any other way. To him, the money was both curse and ticket. It promised relief but asked for silence in return. As the dawn gray crept across the city, the cash had begun to flow into places that looked, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. A restaurant that always seemed busy took in more than its menu could explain. A chain of small corner shops recorded sales figures that bent reality into a straighter line. To the casual observer, these businesses were legitimate, their receipts diligent. Yet their books had been rewritten, numbers were adjusted, totals inflated or masked. The dollar that began folded in a wallet was now one of many indistinguishable units flowing into an accounting entry labeled income, reviewed, stamped, and filed. On paper, it read like a normal day's haul. In truth, it was the quiet end of an illicit story. At some point, someone higher in the organization would look at those ledgers and nod. The business had done its job. It had absorbed cash that needed new identities. That work required more than a willingness to accept unclean currency. It required a network of people who could make numbers walk without tripping. Accountants with flexible ethics, managers who turned a blind eye, frontline workers who preferred a steady paycheck to moral unease. All of them mattered. Some took orders because they were intimidated. Others took orders because the pay was better than anything else on offer. Few asked where the extra revenue came from. It is easy to rationalize a single compromise. The landlord's payment is late, a child needs medication, the rival business will take over if you refuse. The math of survival is brutal. Tiny moral compromises stack over time into a structure that supports an empire. There were also people whose job was to narrate legitimacy. Consultants who set up business relationships and documents, lawyers who performed the polished language of legality, and middle managers who created a perfunctory trail of meetings and invoices. These people did not necessarily imagine themselves as villains. They viewed their work as problem-solving. They were good at naming things, consulting, service agreements, marketing spend, and giving them plausible paperwork to sit beside. They furnish an aura of normality that is crucial. Law-abiding systems trust documentation. They're designed to assume that paperwork usually means truth. The trick, when the goal is concealment rather than creation, is to make the paperwork convincing enough to survive a casual glance and slippery enough that it confounds deep scrutiny. Farther from the street, the dollar arrived, in a bundle now, at banks whose tellers were trained to spot anomalies, sudden spikes in cash deposits, patterns that deviated from expected customer behavior, transactions that involve names and accounts from faraway places. It is a myth that banks are uniformly complicit. Many are their own first line of defense, relying on compliance officers, software, and training to flag and report suspicious activity. Real human beings, clerks, junior managers, analysts, sit in front of screens and make judgments. Some report, some ignore, some look the other way when the cost of curiosity feels too high. In the spaces where oversight is weak and consequences are diffuse, rationalizations proliferate. Once again, the dollar is no longer just shared currency. It has been slowly rewired into the infrastructure of plausible commerce. There is a figure often imagined in the stories, the banker who sits in a high-rise office and orchestrates the movement of vast sums with a flick of a pen. That image has truth in it, but the reality is less cinematic and more mundane. The people who enable large-scale concealment rarely wear capes or carry decisive power in isolation. They are nodes in a network, people who know loopholes, people who understand where questions are less likely to be asked, people who can suggest the names of trusted intermediaries and the jurisdictions where scrutiny is lighter. They make introductions and provide access. Their value is not technical mastery of crime, but fluency in the language of institutions, how to move through the back doors of regulation without breaking anything overtly enough to trigger alarms. Behind such arrangements are incentives that are simple and corrosive. Profit is the explicit one. Fees for services, cuts for introductions, percentages for moving capital. But there are also subtler drivers: loyalty, fear, outrage at a system perceived as rigged that makes bending the rules feel like a leveling act. For some, complicity is the result of coercion. For others, it is the result of opportunity. The banker's assistant may rationalize the transfers as an odd but lucrative part of the job. The lawyer might call a fabricated invoice a creative financial instrument. A junior accountant might convince herself that nobody will be hurt by one extra line on a balance sheet. Small ethical breaches cascade when institutions and individuals normalize the balancing of competing needs. But evil is rarely monolithic. There are families and neighborhoods that exist on the marginal edges of legality because legitimate options are scarce. There are entire ecosystems that would not simply vanish if the money ceased to flow. The livelihoods of waiters, cleaners, and drivers sometimes depend on income that is partly illicit. This is not a justification. It is an explanation for the social complexity that surrounds dirty money. Destroying the flow without building alternatives often leaves people in worse positions. The moral calculus of enforcement has to reckon with real human consequences, how to dismantle harmful systems without unintentionally harming the vulnerable people who rely on their crumbs. Meanwhile, investigators watch. They do not arrive like thunderbolts, dramatic and immediate. The work is patient and meticulous. It is forensic in the truest sense, mapping patterns, noticing that the corner restaurant's reported sales have no parallel in inventory, following the ghostly trails that documents leave behind, interviewing witnesses whose memories are partial and shaped by fear. The single dollar that began folded in a wallet becomes, under scrutiny, a node in a pattern that points to larger behavior. Investigators do not need to reconstruct every small exchange. They need to show a consistent story of concealment and benefit. For them, the truth is a pattern. Uncovering it requires time, cooperation across borders, and sometimes whistleblowers who bring internal documents to light. Whistleblowers are strange, fragile instruments of accountability. Some act from conscience, others act from grievance or revenge. They risk careers, safety, and peace of mind to hand over a file or testify. Their revelations often look mundane: an email thread with strange payment instructions, a corrected invoice that doesn't make sense, a bank memo marked urgent with no further detail. But when placed beside other anomalies, these mundane things become incriminating. The system that converts dirty cash into the legitimate appearance is full of human flaws: sloppy record-keeping, mismatched dates, signatures that do not line up. Those imperfections are where truth can be pried loose. For the people at the top, exposure is terrifying, not just because it threatens profit, but because it threatens status and freedom. The empire built from hidden revenues purchases mansions and art and political goodwill. It funds campaigns, frontmen, and legitimate ventures. Reputation is currency. Once tarnished, it is hard to repair. So the machinery of concealment is guarded fiercely. Threats are met with legal teams, public relations campaigns, and sometimes darker reactions. Threats escalate, rumors spread. The stakes climb until the kind of compromise that once seemed small now feels existential. Over time, laws respond. Regulations are tightened. International cooperation improves. Compliance becomes a more central part of business operations. Software sifts through transactions looking for patterns. Whistleblower protections encourage reports, and specialized units in law enforcement learn to read the language of financial concealment. That progress is uneven and often reactive. Systems are patched rather than reimagined. Meanwhile, cleverness adapts. Where one loophole is closed, new vehicles for concealment appear. The dance continues. Enforcement, adaptation, enforcement, adaptation. Back where this story began, in a room with a buzzing light, the original participants sleepily move through their routine. The seller worries about rent. The buyer worries about work. The dollar that initiated the scene has now been accounted as revenue in a ledger 2 steps removed from their lives. For them, nothing has changed. The single bill is a kind of sediment in the river of daily survival. For the people further up the chain, the money is a tool of leverage, a source of power that buys votes, influence, and protection. For the investigators, it's a clue. If you trace the dollar through the middle reaches, through ledgers, consultants, and compliance departments, you find something else. The entire structure rests on social institutions designed to trust. Banks, courts, and regulatory bodies are engines of civic life precisely because they allow people to operate at scale. Their trustworthiness is what makes commerce possible. That same trust can be exploited. Systems built to assume honesty cannot, without effort, distinguish every subtle lie from truth. The tension between openness and scrutiny is central. Too much suspicion chokes legitimate business. Too much trust invites abuse. Ultimately, a single dollar is both tiny and enormous. In one sense, it is insignificantly small. You would not notice its absence if it were gone. In another, it is a symbol of how small acts accumulate into vast arrangements. The dollar's journey shows how easily routine behavior accumulates into systemic problems when incentives favor concealment over transparency. It teaches a harder lesson, that crime is not only violent spectacle and dramatic conspiracies, but also the mundane arithmetic of complicity, the ways ordinary people, institutions, and small choices fold into larger harms. And so the dollar keeps moving. It will be folded into payrolls and invoices, bought with muted applause and anxiety. Lawyers will debate language, auditors will check boxes and sigh when numbers won't reconcile. Somewhere, a young investigator will stare at a spreadsheet and notice an oddity. Somewhere else, a person offered the chance to speak up will weigh fear against conscience. In those moments, small, human, clumsy, the possibility of change exists, not as a single sweeping gesture, but as patient work, better laws, honest enforcement, social support for those who would otherwise choose complicity, and an ongoing willingness to look at where money flows and why. The city wakes. The van is parked now, its load moved into the day. Servers flip on the neon pails, and breakfast orders begin at the restaurant that had been part of the night's route. The dollar lies somewhere in the world, indistinguishable from others. Its past, known only to a few. It has been born in a small act of exchange and absorbed into a system that both sustains and harms. Its journey is a quiet lesson in how societies get built and how they break. The dollar no longer carried the smell of smoke or the memory of hurried hands. It had been bundled with thousands of others, pressed flat beneath the weight of rubber bands, and counted until the paper felt less like money and more like raw material. By the time it reached its next destination, it was stripped of personality, a faceless note among faceless stacks. That was the intention. Memory had to be erased if the dollar was to survive. It sat inside a box labeled as office supplies. The van that carried it looked identical to a dozen others idling outside the city's warehouse district. The driver was unremarkable, dressed in cheap polyester, sipping coffee from a stained thermos. Nothing about him drew attention, and that was the point. In this business, invisibility was more valuable than speed. The box was delivered without signature, carried up a flight of stairs, and set down in the back room of a company that, on paper, sold cleaning equipment. The receptionist out front smiled politely at visitors. Catalogs were neatly displayed. A computer hummed at the desk, filled with spreadsheets of sales that had never happened and customers who had never ordered anything. The business existed, yes, but only as a shell. Its real inventory was cash, and its real product was transformation. The dollar was logged, not with ink or digital code, but with a glance and a nod. The men who opened the box knew exactly what they were looking at. They handled the stacks like mechanics examining an engine. This was fuel, and it had to be fed into the machine carefully. Some of it would be dispersed through false invoices, a delivery of industrial mops to a client that didn't exist, a bulk order of paper towels for a hotel that had closed years ago, a shipment of disinfectant that would never leave the warehouse. Each invoice was typed neatly, printed, stamped, and filed. To anyone auditing the company, the paperwork seemed solid. The numbers lined up. Revenue looked healthy. The cleaning company was a success, at least on paper. This was the first true disguise. The dollar, once dirty, was now part of a sale. Its origins were hidden beneath the fiction of commerce. Yet this was only the beginning. To truly vanish, the money had to move again, across borders and accounts, until no one could trace its lineage. At the center of this process was a figure the employees never named aloud. He was referred to only as the client. He rarely appeared in person. Instructions arrived through intermediaries, coded phrases on disposable phones, or meetings arranged in crowded places where surveillance was impossible. He was the banker, the one who understood the arteries of finance like a surgeon understands the body. Where others saw numbers, he saw pathways. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. The banker did not look like the villains of cinema. He was soft-spoken, his suits conservative, his manners impeccable. He dined in expensive restaurants without ostentation, always choosing tables near the back where he could watch the room. To most who encountered him, he seemed like a discreet consultant, a man trusted to handle sensitive financial matters for wealthy clients. And, in a sense, that was true. His clients simply happened to be cartels, and their sensitivity was born of illegality. When the dollar entered his world, it became data. He saw it not as paper, but as a figure to be moved, disguised, and reintroduced. His office, if one could call it that, was not a skyscraper downtown, but a suite inside a law firm that prided itself on confidentiality. From there, the banker directed traffic. Some of the money flowed into accounts registered to offshore companies, firms with names so bland they seemed designed to be forgotten. Others were funneled into real estate, apartments purchased under trusts, properties rented at inflated rates to cooperative tenants. A portion was invested in art, antiques, or commodities, all items whose value could fluctuate conveniently. For our dollar, the chosen path was corporate layering. The shell cleaning company invoiced another shell company, this one registered in a Caribbean jurisdiction notorious for secrecy. The invoice described a consulting service, hours of advice that had never been given, meetings that had never occurred. Payment was recorded as a wire transfer, complete with a reference number and a stamp from the bank. On paper, it looked as if a legitimate international business transaction had taken place. In reality, it was nothing more than one pocket paying another. Once the transfer cleared, the money was no longer cash. It was digits, a line of code in a bank's system, indistinguishable from billions of other transactions processed that day. The dollar's new form was liquid, able to travel across borders in seconds, shielded by banking secrecy and protected by the sheer volume of global finance. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, it was invisible. The banker smiled at this stage. He understood the paradox. The larger the transaction, the easier it was to hide. Billions moved daily in legitimate commerce, imports, exports, loans, investments. Within that tidal wave, a few million laundered dollars were barely a ripple. It was the perfect camouflage. But invisibility required vigilance. The banker employed teams of lawyers and accountants who crafted narratives for the funds. If regulators asked, there were contracts ready to show, minutes from board meetings that had never happened, signatures notarized in ink that still smelled fresh. Every document was a prop in a theater of legitimacy, and as long as the actors played their roles, the illusion held. The dollar moved again, this time into an account in Luxembourg. From there, it was combined with funds from other sources, some legal, some not, and invested into a mutual fund. The returns were modest but steady, and most importantly, clean. When the money came out again, months later, it was profit, taxed, reported, and legal. The dollar's journey from a dimly lit kitchen table to a respectable bank statement was complete. Or so it seemed. Because for every banker, there is an investigator. For every false invoice, there is someone willing to cross-check a signature or question a date. And while the banker believed his system was airtight, there were cracks invisible to him, cracks that, given enough time, would widen. The shell company is now alive, though it breathes only on paper. It has no employees, no products, no factory lights that burn through the night. Yet, to the world outside, it looks ordinary enough. A modest business with a modest address. Another name on the endless list of entities that come up and go without anyone paying too much attention. The dollar, still carrying the weight of its past, is funneled in through carefully structured invoices. Goods that never exist are said to have been shipped, and payments are logged as if a normal trade had taken place. On the balance sheet, the money seems legitimate, earned by fair exchange. In reality, nothing has moved but numbers on a screen and signatures on a page. The banker understands the delicate art of timing. To wash money is not simply to disguise it, but to make it flow in a way that no one questions. If $1 million suddenly appears in the account of a tiny import business, suspicion will bloom like smoke from a fire. But if that same million is broken down, wired in from multiple sources, routed through friendly accounts overseas, and then allowed to settle slowly, it begins to look natural, like water filling a basin drop by drop until the pool is full. And so the banker builds his web. One account opens in Panama, another in the British Virgin Islands, a third in a quiet Swiss canton where questions are few and answers take months. Each is controlled not by his name, but by layers of nominees and companies that exist solely to create confusion. The dollar enters one strand of the web and disappears, re-emerging elsewhere dressed in the attire of legitimacy. By the time it reaches the end of its path, it no longer resembles the crumpled note that began in a dimly lit room. But there are risks in every turn. Wire transfers leave trails, however faint, and regulators, though often slow, are trained to notice patterns that do not quite add up. The banker knows this. That is why he never lets the money rest too long in one place. It is always moving, always crossing borders, always searching for the perfect resting ground where its history will be erased by the simple passage of time and the thickness of bureaucracy. The cartel understands none of this in detail. To them, the banker is a magician, a man who takes stacks of dangerous paper and returns them as assets. Luxury cars, real estate deeds, investments in shopping malls that never seem to lose money. They see the results, but not the machinery. And the banker prefers it that way, for the less they know, the safer he is. He is not a man of loyalty, but of calculation, and calculation demands distance. The dollar, meanwhile, continues its silent transformation. From the shell company, it is sent abroad, declared as profit from an overseas sale. The banker arranges a transfer back into the country, but now it arrives as revenue, taxed and recorded. A small percentage is given to the government as duty, a sacrifice to maintain the illusion. The rest is deposited, free to be spent openly. What was once criminal has now become respectable, capable of buying influence without raising alarms. Yet shadows are never far. In an office miles away, an investigator scrolls through records, piecing together fragments of data. A shipping invoice without a shipment. A company with revenue but no employees. A transaction that passes through 3 jurisdictions in a single week. The threads are thin, almost invisible, but to the trained eye, they hint at a story waiting to be told. The banker knows he must stay ahead, for the hunter is patient, and every illusion has its flaw. And so the game deepens. The banker lights another cigarette as the city hums outside his window, the glow of skyscrapers reflecting in the glass. Each one of those buildings he knows hides stories like his, accounts balanced on illusions, fortunes made from shadows. The dollar he guides is no longer alone. It has multiplied, joined by thousands of others, all traveling the same unseen routes. Together they form rivers of wealth that feed industries both real and imagined, flowing into construction sites, art auctions, and gleaming hotels where no questions are asked and no origins discussed. The brilliance of the system lies not in complexity, but in plausibility. Every layer of the process has just enough truth to survive a casual glance. The invoices seem real. The transfers are properly recorded. The companies exist on registries that anyone can access. Nothing screams fraud, and yet everything is built on nothing. To the banker, the challenge is not in making the money vanish, but in making it look boring, unremarkable, as if it belongs. Still, cracks always threaten to appear. A careless courier caught with too much cash, a local journalist asking questions about a property development that never seems to finish, a regulator noticing that the same names surface in places they shouldn't. The banker thrives on control, but he cannot control everything. He relies on bribes, favors, and a network of insiders who smooth the rough edges whenever reality intrudes on illusion. Every month costs money, but that cost is nothing compared to the price of exposure. For the cartel, the transformation is a triumph. The dirty bills that once sat in duffel bags are now reborn as investments, accounts, and assets that can be displayed without shame. A new nightclub opens funded by investors. A chain of restaurants expands its profits, seemingly from food but in truth drawn from blood. The public dances in the neon lights, unaware that the floor beneath them is built on the bones of a hidden trade. The dollar, once crumpled and anonymous, now circulates in plain sight. It has been cleaned, not by soap and water, but by paperwork and deception. It can be deposited in banks, withdrawn in digital form, used to buy influence in boardrooms and politics alike. What began as evidence of crime is now the fuel of legitimacy. That is the paradox of laundering, crime reborn as order, vice disguised as virtue. But even as the banker watches his empire of paper grow, he feels the weight of eyes. Someone is always watching, even if only faintly. A case file grows in the drawer of an investigator. A name appears in whispers across agencies. The trail is faint, but trails have a way of converging, no matter how carefully scattered. The banker knows this game cannot last forever, but he plays it all the same, because to stop is to fall, and falling is something men like him never allow. And so the dollar rests, for now, in the comfort of a clean balance sheet. It has crossed the underworld and emerged untarnished, ready to begin its new life. But its past lingers like a shadow, waiting for the day someone dares to trace it back to the night where everything began. The investigator sits at his desk long after the rest of the office is emptied, the glow of a single lamp spreading across towers of files that lean like weary soldiers waiting for orders. In front of him, a screen flickers with rows of numbers, names of companies that seem to exist nowhere but on paper, transfers that skip across borders like stones on water. Most people would see nothing but static, meaningless data that slips away when the eyes grow tired. But he has learned to look differently, to search for patterns in the noise, to hear the faint echoes of truth inside the machinery of deception. The dollar he chases does not leave footprints, but it does leave ripples, and ripples are enough. His name is not important here. What matters is his obsession. Years of chasing the shadows of organized crime have eroded the boundaries between his work and his life. Friends drifted away, dinners were missed, sleep became a stranger. Yet every sacrifice hardened his focus until nothing remained but the hunt. He knows the cartels will never stop moving money, and for every case broken open, another 3 remain hidden. Still, he persists because he has learned that systems, no matter how perfect, always contain flaws. And greed, no matter how patient, always leaves a scar. Tonight, the scar lies buried in a shipping manifest from a port city that does not often appear on his radar. The company claims to have imported a shipment of industrial washers, thousands of them from a supplier overseas. On the surface, the paperwork is in order. The invoices are stamped, the payments logged, the taxes paid. But something nags at him. The company has no warehouse, no delivery vehicles, not even a staff large enough to unload such a shipment. Where, then, did these washers go? He traces the trail further and finds another company, one that received a resale of the goods. That company, too, is hollow, existing only at a rented office suite with a locked door and no sign on the wall. The pattern is familiar. Shells stacked on shells, disguises piled one upon another until the truth is buried. Yet the investigator feels a thrill of recognition. He has seen this trick before, though never executed with such precision. The banker behind it must be skilled, someone who has studied not only the laws of finance, but also the weaknesses of men who enforce them. That realization fuels him, because skill means ego, and ego means mistakes. Across the ocean, the banker grows uneasy without knowing why. He has not met the investigator, has not even heard his name, but he feels the tremors of scrutiny through whispers in meetings, through sudden questions from contacts who used to remain silent. He knows better than to ignore such tremors. Every empire built on shadows trembles eventually, and the ones that survive are those whose masters learn to anticipate the storm. He orders new companies to be formed, fresh accounts to be opened in jurisdictions more secretive, and old trails to be shut down. But the act of shifting brings noise, and noise is dangerous. Meanwhile, the investigator builds his case not on noise, but on silence. He learns to ask, what is missing? The shipment never photographed, the customs inspection that never occurred, the employees who do not exist. Each absence is a thread, and though threads are fragile, woven together they form a rope strong enough to pull down the mask. He spends nights mapping the flow of funds on a wall, strings of yarn stretching from one pin to another until the surface resembles a spider's web. To a stranger, it would look chaotic, but to him it is a map of intent, a chart of deception that slowly takes shape. The dollar he chases is no longer the crumpled bill that began in the hands of a dealer. It has been broken, merged, transformed 100 times over, but he does not need the bill itself, only the evidence of its journey. Every time it changes hands, someone takes a fee, and every fee leaves a mark. Banks record transfers, phone calls leave metadata, meetings leave security footage. The cartel believes itself untouchable, but in truth it is bleeding tiny drops of information with every move, and he is there to catch each drop before it evaporates. Yet the hunt wears on him. The case expands, swallowing weeks, then months, until he loses track of seasons. His superiors question the hours he spends, the resources consumed by what seemed like little more than suspicion. They want results, names, arrests, headlines that prove their budgets are justified. He gives them only fragments, whispers of a larger picture he has not yet uncovered. The pressure mounts, but he does not relent. He has learned that to chase money is to chase ghosts, and ghosts reveal themselves only to those willing to walk among them in darkness. One evening, while scanning transaction logs from a Caribbean bank, he notices something curious. A series of deposits, each small enough to avoid mandatory reporting, spread across multiple accounts that all trace back to the same parent company. The amounts are irregular, just enough to mimic ordinary business revenue. But the timing is too perfect. Every deposit occurs within minutes of each other, as though orchestrated by a hidden conductor. He digs deeper and discovers that these funds, once pooled together, are wired to a property developer in his own city. The developer is well known, respected even, with ties to politicians who attend his parties and cut ribbons at his projects. To accuse him would be unthinkable. Yet, the money does not lie. The investigator feels the walls close in. He knows that to follow this path will draw the attention not just to the banker, but of powerful figures who thrive on silence. Whistleblowers vanish, cases collapse, careers end suddenly. Still, he presses forward, documenting everything, duplicating his files in secret, sending copies to contacts he trusts in case he is silenced. The deeper he digs, the clearer the picture becomes. The banker is not simply laundering money for criminals. He is weaving it into the very fabric of society, turning crime into commerce, shadow into light. For the banker, this is victory. To him, laundering is not merely about hiding money, but about transforming it into influence so clean that it can shake hands with presidents and buy laws as easily as it buys property. The dollar that once whispered of blood now speaks the language of legitimacy, funding campaigns, endowing charities, building monuments. But the investigator sees through the costume, and he knows that behind every marble facade lies the echo of the street deal that began the journey. The chase grows more dangerous as he closes in. Phones click with the telltale signs of surveillance. Cars linger too long outside his apartment. A letter arrives without a sender, warning him to leave the case alone. He shows it to no one, not even his closest colleagues, for he has learned that threats are both tests and promises. He chooses to interpret it as proof that he is getting closer, and he is. Through months of painstaking work, he traces the web back to a single hub, an account managed by a man whose name rarely appears in public, but whose fingerprints are everywhere in the flow of funds. The banker. He has no photographs of him, no recordings, only fragments of testimony from those who barely knew him. The man is a ghost, but a ghost who moves billions. The investigator prepares his report, a document thick with evidence yet delicate as glass. He knows the moment he submits it, forces beyond his control will decide whether the case lives or dies. He fears it will be buried, smothered by influence and fear, but he also knows that silence is complicity, and he has sacrificed too much to remain complicit. As dawn breaks, he locks the file in a drawer and leans back, exhausted. He thinks of the dollar that began this journey, how it has traveled further than most men ever will, how it has crossed borders and identities until it has become both everything and nothing. He wonders if capturing it will ever truly matter, if stopping one banker will halt a tide that has flowed for centuries. Yet in the quiet, he reminds himself of the truth he clings to, that shadows exist only because someone dares to hold the light. Far away, the banker receives word that his name has been whispered in places it should not be. For the first time in years, he feels a crack in the armor of his creation. He orders accounts closed, assets shifted, trails erased, but even as he moves, he senses the inevitable. The investigator is out there, threading the rope from fragments, and one day that rope will tighten. The game is not over, but the end has begun. And somewhere, deep within the labyrinth of money and lies, the single dollar rests quietly, unaware of the storm it has unleashed, waiting to see whose hands it will end up in when the final curtain falls. The walls always close in slowly. At first, there are only whispers, faint enough to dismiss. Then small inconveniences arise, an account frozen for review, a transfer delayed by regulators asking questions they never asked before. To the banker, these are warning signs, subtle cracks in a structure he once believed unbreakable. He has lived by the rule that nothing lasts forever, and yet he allowed himself to believe his empire might be the exception. Now he feels the weight of inevitability pressing closer with each passing day. The investigator, though exhausted, sharpens his focus. The report he submitted has stirred interest, though not the kind he expected. Some of his superiors are nervous, others hostile. There are meetings behind closed doors from which he is excluded. Still, the evidence is undeniable. Too many strings converge at the banker's name. Too many shadows point to the same hidden figure. International partners begin to take notice. A task force is quietly formed, its members drawn from agencies that rarely trust each other. For the first time, the hunter is no longer alone. The banker responds with his usual discipline. Assets are shifted into gold and art, objects that move more quietly than wires. Trusted lieutenants are told to disappear for a time to let the heat pass. Companies are dissolved overnight, accounts drained before anyone can react. But with each movement comes noise, and the noise only attracts more attention. Investigators in 3 countries begin to see the same patterns, the same familiar fingerprints of deception. The banker is still a ghost, but the outline of his body is taking shape. Within the cartel, whispers spread. Some blame the banker for the tension. Others fear he has become a liability. For years, he was untouchable, the man who turned dirty paper into palaces and power. Now they wonder if his genius has made him reckless. Suspicion is poison in their world, and once it takes root, it is nearly impossible to remove. The banker knows this, and he feels the chill of betrayal lurking nearby. One night, a courier fails to arrive. A shipment of cash vanishes between one city and the next. No explanation is given, no answers offered. The banker understands without being told. Someone close to him has turned, feeding information to the hunters in exchange for survival. Betrayal is always part of the equation, but it cuts deeper when it comes from inside the circle he built himself. He doubles his precautions, narrows the list of those he trusts, but the damage is already done. Every day the walls move closer. The investigator senses the shift as well. New leads arrive more quickly. New witnesses step forward with fragments of testimony. One former accountant for a shell company agrees to talk under protection, providing documents that confirm what the investigator already suspected. The banker's empire rests on paper, thin as ash, and once a spark is struck, the entire structure can burn. The case file grows thick enough to bend the metal clips that hold it together. The picture is no longer vague. It is sharp, undeniable, ready to be presented to a court. But power does not yield easily. Lawyers appear, armies of them, ready to challenge every document, every witness, every interpretation of the law. Politicians whose campaigns were funded by laundered money quietly lobby for the investigation to be delayed, weakened, forgotten. The investigator feels the pressure like a hand on his throat. More than once, He wonders if the case will collapse, if all his years of obsession will end in silence. Yet the momentum has grown too great to stop. Journalists begin to circle, sensing a story too large to ignore. Public attention is a weapon, and for the first time, it is aimed at the banker. The arrest comes not with a roar, but with a whisper. At dawn, a convoy of unmarked vehicles slides through quiet streets to a mansion that rises above the city like a fortress. Inside, the banker sips his coffee, calm despite the unease gnawing at him. When the doors burst open and armed officers pour into the room, he does not resist. He knows better than to fight a battle already lost. He places the cup down, adjusts his cuffs, and waits for the handcuffs as though they are nothing more than another transaction. The news spreads quickly. Headlines proclaim the capture of the man once called the banker of the cartels. Photographs of him in custody flood the screens, his expression unreadable, his posture unbroken. To the public, it is a victory, proof that the law can still reach into the darkest corners. To the cartel, it is a disaster, a breach in the wall that protected them from exposure. Panic ripples through their ranks as they scramble to contain the damage, to erase connections before they are uncovered. In court, the banker remains composed. Prosecutors present mountains of evidence, files stacked higher than the judge's bench, witnesses who speak in trembling voices about the empire he built. He listens quietly, his face betraying nothing. When asked to respond, he offers only fragments, careful words that reveal little. To him, the trial is not about guilt or innocence, but about time. Every day he spends in custody is a day his allies work to dismantle the case, to bribe, to threaten, to manipulate the fragile machinery of justice. The investigator attends each session, watching from the back of the room. He feels both triumph and dread. Triumph that the man he hunted for years now sits in chains. Dread that the system may still fail, that money and influence may yet tip the scales. He knows the banker has survived worse storms, and he cannot allow himself to believe victory is certain until the final verdict is read. Outside the courthouse, crowds gather. Some cheer, others jeer, convinced the trial is nothing more than theater. The world has grown cynical, accustomed to seeing powerful men slip away untouched. Yet there is a hunger for justice, a desire to believe that even the untouchable can fall. The banker becomes a symbol, not just of crime, but of the possibility of its defeat. Behind bars, his calm begins to fracture. Letters arrive from lawyers with bad news, from allies who have disappeared, from contacts who can no longer be reached. The empire he built so carefully unravels thread by thread, faster than he imagined. Properties are seized, accounts frozen, allies arrested. The betrayal he feared has become reality. Men he once trusted now testify against him, trading loyalty for lighter sentences. He lies awake in his cell at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the echo of footsteps in the corridor. For the first time in decades, he feels the weight of power slipping from his hands. The verdict comes after weeks of testimony. Guilty. The word echoes through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of an era. The banker sits motionless, as if carved from stone. Reporters scribble furiously, cameras flash. The investigator exhales a breath he has been holding for years. It is over, at least in part. The empire has been wounded, its architect brought low. But even in victory, there is unease. The investigator knows that laundering is not the work of one man alone, that for every banker caught, there are others waiting to take his place. The system survives because greed never dies. The banker is led away, his figure swallowed by guards. Some say he will spend the rest of his life behind walls. Others whisper he will not last long in prison. The cartel does not forgive betrayal, and to them, capture is betrayal enough. Whether by law or by revenge, his fate is sealed. The investigator returns to his desk, weary but resolute. He looks at the files that remain, the cases still unsolved, the names still hidden in shadows. He knows his work is far from finished. The fall of one man does not end the flow of dollars that travel from street corners to balance sheets. The river still runs, and he is still its hunter. Yet for one night, he allows himself to feel the weight of triumph, the knowledge that even in a world built on lies, truth can still break through. And somewhere, lost among countless accounts and transactions, a dollar rests once more, its journey paused but not ended. It has seen the rise of empires and the fall of kings, carried secrets across oceans, survived betrayals and victories alike. It waits silently, ready to begin again, because in the world of shadows, money never truly dies. The verdict had echoed like thunder, but thunder fades, and in the silence that followed, the world did what it always does. It adjusted. For a brief time, the banker's face filled every screen. His name whispered with awe and fear. His downfall celebrated as a triumph of justice. Yet empires do not crumble in a single day, and money does not stop moving because one man is locked behind walls. The cartels mourned no one. They understood that power was not a person, but a system, and systems endure. In boardrooms hidden from sight, in villas guarded by silence, they met to decide the future. Some cursed the banker for his arrogance, others for his caution, but all agreed on one truth: their fortunes must not remain idle. Without motion, money suffocates. Without laundering, their empire starves. In another city, the investigator sat alone, the taste of victory souring in his mouth. He had spent years tracing shadows, sacrificing everything to capture the ghost who had eluded so many before him. Now that the ghost was caged, he felt no peace. Files still covered his desk, names still lingered unsolved, transfers still leaped across borders like sparks in the wind. He had imagined the end would bring clarity, maybe even joy, but it had delivered only exhaustion and the certainty that the war was not over. He looked at the photographs of companies still operating, the accounts untouched, the allies who had escaped. They had cut down the tree, but the roots remained deep, hidden beneath soil too thick to reach. The banker adapted to prison life with the same calculation that had guided him in freedom. He studied routines, memorized guards' habits, learned the currency of favors behind the walls. He did not rant or beg, he observed. Power was simply a game of perception, and even here, perception could be bent. Inmates approached him cautiously, some in admiration, others in resentment. To many, he was a legend, proof that one man could outwit governments and move billions unseen. To others, he was a liability, a man whose capture had brought heat upon everyone. He let them believe what they wished. He knew survival depended on patience, and patience he had in abundance. But the world outside had already begun to reshape itself around his absence. A younger generation of launderers stepped forward, eager to prove themselves. They had studied his methods like scripture, but they were not bound by his traditions. They moved faster, using digital currencies, encrypted ledgers, online marketplaces that never closed. What took the banker months, they accomplished in hours. They no longer needed suitcases of cash or warehouses filled with fake invoices. With a few keystrokes, they could spend money across the globe, hiding it in the blur of endless data. The investigator saw this shift and felt dread. He had defeated a master of paper and wire, but now he faced an army of ghosts living in screens, untouchable and unseen. The cartels invested heavily in these new magicians. They cared nothing for loyalty, only results, and results came quickly. Properties were purchased through shell accounts created in seconds. Entire fortunes were hidden inside tokens no one could trace. Governments struggled to keep pace, their laws written for a world of ink and stamps, not for one of algorithms and code. The investigator tried to learn, attending briefings, questioning experts, but the speed of change was overwhelming, and by the time he understood one method, 3 new ones had emerged. The river of money had become an ocean, and he felt himself drowning. At night, he thought of the banker, sitting in his cell, cut off from the empire he had built. Did he know how the world had changed? Did he sense the evolution of the trade he once controlled? Sometimes the investigator imagined him smiling in the dark, amused that his capture had only birthed a new generation stronger than before. Sometimes he imagined him bitter, furious that the game he perfected had passed into younger hands. Either way, the investigator could not escape his shadow. Even in defeat, the banker haunted him. The cartels, emboldened by their success, grew reckless. They bought politicians openly, funded elections without disguise, poured money into industries too powerful to fail. Construction, technology, energy, no corner of society was untouched. Citizens walked through shining malls, checked into glittering hotels, danced in nightclubs without realizing the floor beneath them was laid by blood. To speak of it was dangerous. To prove it nearly impossible. Money was the ultimate disguise, and it wore respectability well. The investigator tried to sound the alarm, but his warnings fell on tired ears. Politicians did not want to hear that their donors were tainted. Banks did not want to hear that their profits were poisoned. Citizens did not want to hear that their prosperity was built on crime. He was called paranoid, obsessive, a man who had given too much of himself to a fight that could not be won. Slowly, doors began to close. His budget was cut, his team reassigned, his authority diminished. The victory that had once raised him high now left him isolated. In prison, the banker learned of these developments through whispers carried by visitors and guards. He smiled to himself, a faint, knowing smile. He had always believed the system was larger than any man, even himself. His capture had been inevitable, but so was the continuation of the game. Others had taken his place, and the river flowed faster than ever. He felt no jealousy, only satisfaction. He had been right. The world would never stop laundering money, because the world itself demanded it. Without it, too many structures would collapse, too many truths would surface. Society needed shadows to survive, and he had merely been their servant. The investigator, now weary beyond his years, began to question himself. Was the pursuit worth the cost? He had no family left, no friends who understood him, no life outside the hunt. He had won the battle, and lost everything else. Some nights he dreamed of the dollar, the crumpled bill that had begun it all. He saw it moving endlessly, always out of reach, always one step ahead. He wondered if chasing it had been madness all along, if the river was meant to flow forever. Yet even in despair, he felt the fire of obsession burn. He could not stop. To stop was to admit defeat, and he had given too much to surrender now. The cartels, ever adaptive, began to whisper of a return. Though the banker remained behind walls, his legend was too strong to die. They spoke of him as a teacher, a prophet of shadows. Some claimed to act in his name, invoking him as justification for their methods. Others sought to surpass him, to prove that they could succeed where he had fallen. His name became currency, traded among criminals and financiers alike. Even in silence, he had become immortal. And so the cycle continued. Money flowed from street deals to accounts, from accounts to investments, from investments to power. The investigator chased it, writing reports no one read, fighting battles no one acknowledged. The banker watched from his cell, content to let the world spin, knowing that his absence meant nothing. The cartels thrived. Their empires rebuilt stronger than before, and the dollar, the same dollar that had begun the journey long ago, still moved through hands unseen, carrying with it the memory of everything it had touched. Because in the end, money is never clean. It carries shadows, no matter how often it is laundered, no matter how brightly it shines. It whispers of blood, of betrayal, of power. It flows through the veins of society, unseen yet essential, binding together the worlds of crime and respectability until they are indistinguishable. The investigator understood this now, though he wished he did not. The banker had always known it. The cartels depended on it. And the dollar, silent and eternal, would never stop moving. The years passed in silence, though silence never truly meant stillness. Inside the walls, the banker aged, his hair turning the color of ash, his eyes softening, but never losing their edge. Time took its toll, yet he remained untouched by despair. He watched men arrive and men depart, some carried out in coffins, others released with promises they could not keep. He listened to the endless rumors that swirled around him, some declaring his influence had vanished, others insisting he still controlled rivers of money with a mere word whispered through the right ear. He encouraged neither belief nor denial. He let the myths grow on their own, knowing that myths were stronger than facts. A man forgotten was truly gone, but a man surrounded by legend could live forever. Outside, the world was no longer recognizable to the one who had first drawn lines of ink across ledgers and sent wires across oceans. The young magicians of code had transformed the art of laundering into something even governments depended on. Cryptocurrencies, offshore havens disguised as startups, banks that branded themselves as innovators while quietly feeding off blood money. Everything was faster, smoother, safer for those who understood it. Cartels no longer needed armies of couriers or briefcases stuffed with cash. They needed laptops, encrypted keys, networks hidden behind layers of anonymity. The game had evolved, but the purpose was the same: turn shadows into light, make the dirty clean, and let the cycle continue unbroken. The investigator lived long enough to see this transformation, though he wished he hadn't. His victories had aged poorly. The banker's capture was remembered briefly, a headline that faded like yesterday's storm. The new generation of launderers did not even bother to hide his lessons. They improved them, streamlined them, laughed at the idea that one man's arrest could change anything. The investigator was pushed into a quiet corner, his office stripped of authority, his warnings treated like noise. He had sacrificed his family, his health, his peace of mind for a battle that the world no longer cared to fight. And still, he could not let go. He scribbled notes in worn notebooks, mapped networks on his walls long after anyone came to see them. He lived alone in the shadow of his obsession, chasing ghosts across screens until his eyes burned and his hands shook. Sometimes he dreamed of meeting the banker again, not in a courtroom, not in chains, but across a table, face to face with nothing between them. He imagined asking the question that haunted him most. Why? Why build an empire knowing it could only end in ruin? Why poison the world for profit? Why never stop, even when there was enough to buy freedom 1,000 times over? In his dreams, the banker always answered with the same smile, a smile that said there had never been a choice. Money moved because it had to. It sought power the way rivers sought the sea. The banker had not created the current. He had only learned to ride it. That truth tormented the investigator more than anything else. The cartels, meanwhile, had grown beyond cartels. They were no longer shadows hiding at the edge of society. They were woven into its very core. They owned hotels in cities tourists called safe, energy companies that powered entire nations, tech firms that promised a brighter future. Politicians depended on their donations. Banks depended on their deposits. Communities depended on the jobs they created. To pull their money out would mean collapse. Everyone knew, and no one admitted it. The line between crime and legitimacy had blurred until it was gone. The banker watched this with quiet pride, though from afar. News reached him in fragments. A company rising in one hemisphere, a government scandal in another. He saw his fingerprints in every story, faint but undeniable. The faces were new, the tools more advanced, but the heart of the machine remained the same. He did not need to participate. He had already won. His victory was not in the wealth he had accumulated, nor in the years of freedom he had stolen, but in the permanence of the system he had shaped. He knew that even when he was dust, the rivers of money would still flow, and his name would still echo in whispers. The investigator died quietly, without headlines. His body discovered days later in the apartment he had turned into a mausoleum of maps and notes. Few came to his funeral. Fewer still remembered the cause that had consumed him. To the world, he had been another bureaucrat lost to time, another man who had worked too hard for too little. But among the documents he left behind, buried beneath stacks of photographs and bank statements, there was a final letter. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but its words were clear. I once believed this was a war that could be won. I now understand it is not a war at all, but a current that sweeps us, whether we choose it or not. We build our lives on rivers of money, and those rivers are never clean. I chased shadows until I became one myself. To anyone who reads this, know that the truth is simple. The system does not need the criminals. It creates them. That letter was never published. It was filed away in archives, forgotten by all but a handful of weary clerks. But the truth within it remained, hidden like the networks it described, waiting to be discovered again and again by those foolish enough to believe they could fight the tide. In his final years, the banker grew frail, but he never lost the glint in his eyes. Guards noted how he still carried himself with quiet dignity, how he never begged for favors or showed weakness. Some swore that even other inmates treated him with reverence, as though he were not a prisoner, but a king in exile. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast his cell in fading light, he whispered to no one in particular, "It was never about me. It was about the river." Those were the last words anyone remembered him speaking. He died soon after, his body claimed without ceremony, buried in an unmarked grave. Yet his death changed nothing. The myths grew stronger. Young launderers still spoke his name in hushed tones, claiming lineage to his methods, invoking him like a saint of the underworld. Investigators still used his story as training material, a warning of what one man could accomplish. Politicians still denied the depth of the currents flowing beneath them, and the money still moved from the street corners of forgotten neighborhoods to the tallest skyscrapers of gleaming capitals, passing through hands that pretended not to feel its weight. The final truth lingered like smoke. The system could not end because it was not separate from the world. It was the world. Every transaction, every deal, every empire was touched by shadows. The banker had simply revealed it. The investigator had simply tried to fight it, and both had been consumed in the attempt. The river flowed on, endless, silent, eternal. And somewhere, a single dollar bill changed hands, as it always had, as it always would, carrying within its fibers the memory of every shadow it had ever passed through. No one noticed, no one cared. But if you listened closely, you could almost hear it whisper, "The money never sleeps." And so, the story ends where it began, with a single dollar passed from hand to hand, its journey unseen, yet unstoppable. We have followed it from the streets to the boardrooms, through prisons and palaces, across oceans, and into the veins of nations. We have seen the rise and fall of men who believed that they could control the river, only to be swept away by its current. The truth is simple, and it is terrifying. Money laundering is not an exception. It is the rule. The shadows are not hidden behind society. They are woven into its fabric. For every banker caught, another waits in silence. For every investigator who sacrifices everything, the system adapts and endures. The dollar never stops moving. It does not sleep. It does not die. And somewhere, even now, it is passing through another hand, carrying with it the memory of everything it has touched. Sleep well.